Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Curious Case of the Stolen Ming Dynasty Teapot. It was a quiet Tuesday morning at the Claybridge Historical Museum, a modest institution tucked away in a sleepy suburb 2 hours outside of Portland, Oregon. The air smelled faintly of old paper and linseed oil, and the usual clatter of ceramic heels on waxed linoleum echoed through the dim halls. Most days, nothing happened here. That was kind of the point. You walk in expecting to see a timeline of regional furniture styles, maybe a dusty Civil War cannonball, and the centerpiece of the East Wing, a delicate Ming Dynasty teapot with twin dragon handles, gifted by an eccentric donor who reportedly won it during a 1950s poker game in Macau. That teapot was gone. No broken glass, no tripped alarms, just an empty, silk-lined plinth in a temperature-controlled case that had been opened without a single visible mark. What followed was not a citywide manhunt or a dramatic chase. There were no dramatic headlines. Instead, a sleepy investigation quietly spread across county lines, revealing layers of forgotten security, volunteer workers with curious pasts, and a teapot with a provenance much murkier than anyone had realized. The first discovery. It was Martha Greeley, the museum's longtime head of collections and unofficial morning coffee coordinator, who discovered the theft. She arrived at 6:42 a.m., precisely 8 minutes ahead of her usual time. A recent plumbing issue had made her anxious about the preservation wing's humidity levels, and she wanted to double-check. Walking past the East Wing's climate-locked exhibit room, she noticed something off. The lighting inside the Ming exhibit was dimmer than usual, and the blue motion indicator, a tiny LED nestled in the corner of the case, wasn't blinking. That alone might not have raised concern, but when she approached, the empty space where the teapot should have been seemed to radiate wrongness. She didn't scream, she didn't call the police. Instead, she sat on the nearest bench and pulled out a pocket notebook she used to track temperature readings. She simply wrote, "Teapot gone, 6:44 a.m., call Larry." Larry was the security contractor. The silent alarm that never sounded. Later that day, museum director Henry Koenig would explain to investigators that the security system had been upgraded in 2017, but hadn't been stress-tested since. A local contractor, originally brought in for landscaping, had moonlighted as an installer for off-the-shelf alarm systems. The cameras weren't looped, they simply hadn't been recording. The last footage on file ended 47 hours before the theft. The sensors in the case hadn't gone off because they had been disabled remotely. There was no sign of physical tampering, which meant someone had admin-level access. Larry Henderson, the aforementioned security consultant, arrived at 8:15 a.m. He was a retired Air Force technician with a penchant for crossword puzzles and occasional chess games in the staff break room. He looked at the casing, then at Martha, and quietly muttered, "Well, that's new." The mystery of the lock. The display case was a reinforced glass cube with a pressure seal and a keyed magnetic lock. The museum used a coded fob to unlock it, a nondescript gray oval that hung from a lanyard in the collections room. That fob had not been moved, according to Martha, and was still present the morning of the theft. The only other way to open the case would have involved a system override via a small console in the back offices. That console had recently been updated. The new interface included a cloud sync feature, accessible via login from any device, a feature added to streamline inventory updates. Koenig had mentioned it offhandedly at a staff meeting. Only 3 people had credentials: Martha, Koenig, and Theo Clemens, the museum's IT coordinator, who hadn't shown up for work in 4 days. Who was Theo? Theo Clemens was a quiet 37-year-old who'd come to the Claybridge Museum after a short and largely unsuccessful stint at a regional tech startup. His resume was solid but unremarkable. His references were sparse. He didn't talk much about himself and mostly worked evenings, often staying late to run diagnostics or push updates. Most of the staff found him polite but vaguely disconnected. He kept a tidy desk but never made coffee. His office had a single-framed photograph, a black-and-white shot of an alleyway in Hong Kong, according to Martha, who had once commented on its mysterious energy. When detectives visited Theo's apartment, they found his car parked out front, keys on the kitchen counter, and a single mug in the sink. The bed was made. His laptop was missing. So was his passport. A question of provenance. As investigators began to trace Theo's movements, a parallel question emerged. Was the teapot even real? The object's donation had come from Richard Whitmore, a now-deceased Portland antiques dealer known for his colorful stories and minor scandals. Whitmore had donated several pieces to smaller regional museums in the early 2000s, and at least 2 were later found to be forgeries. But the teapot had paperwork, a certificate of authenticity from a now-defunct Hong Kong appraisal firm, dated 1983, a customs declaration from San Francisco, a photograph of the object displayed in a collector's home in the 1960s. And yet inconsistencies emerged. The stamp on the base of the teapot was uncommon for Ming porcelain. The glaze finish appeared atypically thin, and no clear record existed of the object's journey between 1949 and 1983. It was possible the teapot was real. It was also possible it had never belonged in the museum at all. Why steal it? This is where the case becomes curiously quiet. The object, even if genuine, was not globally famous. It had no insurance due to budget constraints and no known replicas for resale laundering. So why take it? Some theorized Theo had uncovered the teapot's dubious authenticity and stolen it to sell privately, not as a priceless Ming artifact, but as an intriguing antique with mysterious origins. Others believed it was Theo at all, but someone who knew about the weak security systems and used Theo's login as a digital decoy. And one theory, whispered by staff members over instant oatmeal in the break room, suggested Theo may have been trying to return the teapot. To whom? No one could say. Surveillance ghost. Police later reviewed city security footage of nearby streets. At 3:11 a.m. the night before the teapot was discovered missing, a figure wearing a hooded sweatshirt and carrying what appeared to be a duffel bag was seen walking out of the alley behind the museum and stepping into a white Ford Focus. The license plate was partially obscured by what looked like duct tape. The driver matched Theo's general build, but the image was blurry, and no other cameras caught the vehicle after it turned north onto County Road 6. Theo's bank accounts remained untouched. His phone was switched off. No charges appeared on his debit cards. The man had vanished like a breath on cold glass. When the Claybridge Police Department filed the initial incident report, the stolen teapot barely registered beyond a case number. Detective Selene Ward, a reserved yet meticulous investigator nearing retirement, was assigned to oversee the inquiry. It was supposed to be simple: catalog the missing item, rule out a disgruntled staff member, file the report, and let it gather dust with the dozens of other minor property crimes in the county archive. But Detective Ward had one habit that made her unusual among her peers. She hated assumptions, especially quiet ones. So when she looked at the theft of an obscure, possibly counterfeit teapot and a missing IT tech with a spotless record, she didn't close the file. She opened more. The fingerprints that did belong. Dusting the exhibit case was standard procedure, and Ward didn't expect much. Most staff handled it daily. But when forensics processed the results, 3 partial prints stood out. 2 belonged to staff Martha and Koenig, exactly as expected. The third didn't match anyone in the museum database, or Theo Clemens. The print was entered into the FBI's Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, IAFIS. It came back within 36 hours. Xiao Wei Liang, a Chinese national with a minor fraud conviction in Macau, arrested in 1997 for attempting to sell forged dynastic porcelain to a foreign buyer. He had entered the U.S. twice in the early 2000s, the last record being from 2006. No recent activity, no current visa. The question arose, what was Xiao doing at the Claybridge Museum? Theo's digital footprint. After securing a search warrant, Ward requested access to the museum's cloud inventory system and pulled logs from the past 3 months. The logs revealed something unsettling. Theo's login credentials had been used remotely at odd hours, often between 2:00 and 4:00 a.m. hours when the museum was locked down. More concerning was the location. One login pinged from a location in Seattle, another from Vancouver, British Columbia. The final login came from an IP registered to a private network in Redmond, just 5 days before the theft. Had Theo been traveling, or had someone else been using his credentials? Ward subpoenaed data from Theo's email provider and found several encrypted messages sent from his work addressed to a ProtonMail account registered under a pseudonym, Chasing Jade. The emails were brief and cryptic. It's real, but they don't know. They'll want proof. I'll send base photo. If this moves forward, I want a clean exit. No attachments, no names. But the tone didn't match a man who'd stolen an object just to make a buck. It felt secretive, transactional, calculated. The collection's quiet discrepancy. Martha Greeley invited Detective Ward into the museum's archive room the next day. It was a low-ceilinged, climate-stable basement filled with rows of inventory cabinets and accession forms dating back to the 1940s. Richard Whitmore donated 6 pieces to us, Martha explained, but one always struck me as odd. She opened drawer 7F. Inside were digital scans of Whitmore's donations. Among them, a cracked Tang Dynasty figurine, 2 Edo period ink stones, and a rare Qing Dynasty snuff bottle. All had been appraised, photographed, and checked against museum registries. All except the teapot. It came in a wooden box, Martha said, unlabeled. No customs paperwork, no donor form, just Whitmore's business card and a sticky note that said, "You'll want to lock this one up." The accession paperwork had been completed months after Whitmore's death hastily, by Koenig. Ward pressed him. Koenig admitted the teapot had originally been rejected. "It didn't fit the scope of our collection," he said. "But after Whitmore died, I figured it had charm. We didn't have any Ming ceramics. It brought foot traffic. I didn't ask too many questions." That admission would prove pivotal. Enter the teapot's shadow. After weeks of silence, Ward received a call from Homeland Security. The fingerprint match to Xiao Wei Liang had triggered a deeper look into historic art thefts and black market artifacts. An agent named Evan Chen reached out to brief her. "Liang hasn't been seen in years," Chen said, "but he was once part of a ring that smuggled cultural artifacts out of China during the post-cultural revolution vacuum. Some were genuine, most weren't." Chen had tracked several objects attributed to Liang through quiet auctions and private collectors in Southeast Asia. One of those A porcelain flask with twin dragons matched the Claybridge teapot's form almost identically. Chen offered a theory. The teapot wasn't just stolen, it was reclaimed. The pawn shop lead. A break in the case came not from a sting or surveillance footage, but from a clerk at a Bellevue pawn shop. A man had walked in 2 weeks after the theft and inquired about the potential value of a rare antique teapot from China. He didn't bring the object, just a photo, blurry, low-light, but clear enough to show the twin dragon handles and blue glazing. The clerk, uninterested in porcelain, didn't engage. But the security footage of the visit showed a man bearing resemblance to Theo Clemens, albeit thinner and nervier. That same day, across the street from the pawn shop, a hotel clerk confirmed someone matching Theo's description had checked in using an alias, Thomas C. Wei. The surname stuck out. Wei was the middle name on Xiao Wei Liang's record. What was Theo doing? Ward and Chen dug deeper. Theo had no criminal record, no family connections to China, but his financial history showed several wire transfers over the past year from foreign accounts. The source: an import-export firm based in Kuala Lumpur. The owner: unknown. Through an international mutual assistance request, they obtained registration documents. The firm was a shell. The registration agent listed on the documents was S.W. Liang. The photo that changed the narrative. Chen, now thoroughly convinced this was more than a petty theft, revisited the email string from Theo's account. Though encrypted, a single image had slipped through buried in a deleted folder recovered from the backup server. The photo was of the base of the teapot showing a close-up of the kiln mark. Chen cross-referenced it with known artifact registries and found a near-identical stamp recorded in a 1922 catalog of looted artifacts from the Nanjing Museum. The catalog listed the piece as stolen during the Japanese occupation. The original stamp bore a small imperfection in the left dragon claw, so did the one in the Claybridge image. It was almost certainly the same teapot. If that was true, then the object had been smuggled, sold, and passed through dozens of hands before winding up in a small museum in Oregon. And Theo had figured it out. Whistleblower or thief? Now the narrative shifted. Theo may not have been a thief. He might have been a broker facilitating the return of an artifact to someone he believed was a rightful heir, collector, or even a national agency operating quietly. Chen noted that such exchanges sometimes occurred quietly, outside of diplomatic norms. Repatriation is often messy, expensive, and politically sensitive. Sometimes, people take matters into their own hands, often illegally. But there was no record of a repatriation request or private sale, just the void. Then came the letter. 3 months after the initial theft, the Claybridge Museum received a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single letter, typed unsigned. I'm not sorry. Some objects don't belong on display. They belong home. What you had was never yours to begin with. Don't look for me. Alongside the note was a flash drive. On it, photographs. Close-ups of the teapot being cradled by gloved hands in what appeared to be a high-end conservation lab. A date-stamped video showed the object being carefully packed into a foam-lined crate. The background wall had a placard, National Museum of China, Beijing. Was it real? Detective Ward passed the flash drive to Homeland Security. They ran metadata on the files. The timestamps were real. The video was unaltered. One photo included a faint reflection of the photographer in a stainless steel case. Facial recognition software suggested it was Theo Clemens, or someone almost indistinguishable from him. Chen couldn't confirm the video's location. There were no direct identifiers proving the crate went to China. But unofficially, he believed the teapot had been returned. And Theo vanished, no further traces, no new bank activity, no passport stamps, no digital footprints. It was as though he had fulfilled his role and disappeared into mist. By the start of the 4th month, the Claybridge Museum had quietly removed the exhibit signage from the East Wing. The teapot, or at least the space it once occupied, was no longer mentioned in brochures or on the museum's website. For most casual visitors, it faded from memory like a misplaced trinket in a crowded attic. But Detective Selene Ward hadn't moved on. To her, this wasn't just about a stolen teapot. It was about what it symbolized: a thread in a web of questionable ownership, forgotten crimes, and human motivations more complex than greed. She wanted closure, not just for the museum, but for the idea that justice, however quiet, should be acknowledged. A meeting in a library. It came on a Tuesday, fitting, given that was the same day Martha had first discovered the teapot was missing. Ward had received an encrypted email via a newly created Proton Mail account. The subject line, "Only in person." The body contained a single line. 11:00 a.m. Greenwell Library, local history room, come alone. Greenwell Library was 15 miles away in a small town known more for its annual fishing derby than clandestine meetings. Ward debated the risks, but she wasn't dealing with a violent offender if Theo was behind this. He'd shown nothing but caution and precision. She went. At 11:03 a.m., she entered the local history room, a quiet alcove lined with crumbling city registries and brittle maps. A figure was seated at a long oak table, hoodie, glasses, clean-shaven, and with the unmistakable nervous energy of someone who hadn't slept in days. Theo Clemens. The quiet explanation. Theo didn't say hello. He slid a manila envelope across the table, then leaned back. His voice was calm but flat, like he'd rehearsed this 100 times. "I didn't steal it," he said. "Not in the way you think." He explained everything. Months before the theft, Theo had begun cross-checking the museum's digitized inventory for a back-end data migration. The teapot's record caught his attention because it was unusually sparse: a few scanned documents, an outdated accession note, and no provenance chain beyond Whitmore's alleged ownership. Curiosity turned to obsession. He compared the markings to databases of looted Chinese artifacts and found a 1930s photo catalog from the Nanjing Museum. There, in a grainy black and white image, was the Twin Dragon teapot displayed with a collection known to have vanished during the Second Sino-Japanese War. When he approached Koenig with questions, he was waved off. "The paperwork is good enough," Koenig had said. Theo didn't agree. So he reached out carefully, anonymously, to artifact historians and collectors. One contact in Singapore forwarded him to someone with connections in mainland China. That contact, under the alias Xiao Liang, told him the piece was well known in certain circles and believed to have passed through the black market decades ago. That's when the plan began to form. The disappearing act. Theo hadn't fled in fear. He'd orchestrated a cover, checking into hotels under aliases, using VPNs, rerouting his online activity. He created a digital smoke screen, making it appear he had run. In reality, he'd remained in the Pacific Northwest couch-surfing, sleeping in his car, and when necessary, vanishing into short-term rentals. The plan was simple: extract the teapot using a cloned security key, made during one of his long overnight maintenance sessions, override the museum's outdated alarm system remotely, and meet with a conservation courier representing a private client who claimed to be a liaison for a repatriation initiative. The courier, who may or may not have been Xiao Wei, Liang took possession of the object in a quiet transaction at a waterfront motel. Theo's compensation: nothing but anonymity. "I didn't want money," he said. "I just didn't want it sitting in a glass box in Oregon like a trophy." The complications. But things hadn't gone entirely according to plan. After the exchange, Theo found himself followed a dark sedan trailing him for days. Someone somewhere had noticed the exchange. He relocated, changed cars, wiped his devices. Still, he felt watched. That was when he sent the flash drive to the museum anonymously to document the object's safe transfer and perhaps buy himself some peace of mind. But peace didn't come. What Theo hadn't accounted for was Richard Whitmore's real legacy. A deeper crime. Detective Ward returned to the museum archives and, with Martha's help, began a second audit of Whitmore's donations not just to Claybridge, but to other regional museums. Patterns emerged. Whitmore had a history of gifting objects with no paper trail. Some were later revealed to be forgeries. Others had origins in known smuggling regions. He had no family, no surviving business records, and no formal appraisal certifications. When Ward followed a lead to the Longview Maritime Museum, another institution that had accepted a rare Chinese compass, from Whitmore she discovered it had been quietly removed from display after an appraiser questioned its authenticity. There was more. Whitmore had once operated an import boutique in Hong Kong in the late 1950s, at a time when many looted artifacts were being trafficked under the guise of souvenir sales. In short, Whitmore wasn't just a flamboyant collector. He was a likely smuggling node in a decades-old illicit trade network. And the teapot was the quiet echo of that past. Fallout without flash. Ward could have arrested Theo for unlawful entry, theft, and falsifying records. The law was clear. But the evidence told another story. The item was, almost certainly, stolen property originally. The museum had failed to verify its provenance. Theo had not profited. The artifact had likely been returned to its cultural origin. After weeks of deliberation, the district attorney declined to prosecute. Officially, the case remained open unsolved, with the suspect unable to be located. Unofficially, it was over. A museum transformed. In the months that followed, the Claybridge Museum implemented sweeping changes. All donated items were subject to third-party verification. Inventory management was handed over to an external firm. The East Wing was converted into a rotating exhibition space, focused on the ethics of ownership, telling the story of looted art, repatriation, and the complicated histories museums often ignore. The first display included a printed photograph of the teapot, framed beside a plaque that read, "This object no longer resides here. Sometimes, return is the only form of justice." And what of Theo? He was never seen again, at least not in Claybridge. But 6 months after the exhibit was installed, Martha received a postcard. No return address, no name, just a hand-scrawled message. "You were always kind to me. Thank you for not asking questions you already knew the answers to." The postmark. Seattle. Final reflections. In a world saturated with high-profile heists and cinematic crimes, the Stolen Ming Dynasty Teapot barely registered in the public eye. But to those who paid attention, it was a story about the blurred lines between legality and morality, between possession and provenance, between theft and restitution. Theo Clemens didn't vanish to hide. He vanished because, in his mind, he had corrected a mistake not made one. The Claybridge Museum, humbled and wiser, became a quiet advocate for transparency in cultural preservation. And somewhere, perhaps behind glass or deep within a private collection, a small blue teapot sits not just as a relic of dynastic China, but as proof that even the quietest crimes can carry the weight of history. And so the story ends. But a question lingers in the dim echo of that empty glass case. When justice is done in silence, does it still echo loudly enough for us to hear it? Story 2. The Mailroom Embezzler of Keokuk, Iowa. It began as many quiet crimes do with a clerical error. In the spring of 1994, a low-level audit by the U.S. Postal Service's regional office in Des Moines flagged an anomaly. The Keokuk Post Office had ordered nearly 400% more first-class stamps than any other branch of comparable size in the tri-state area. The discrepancy wasn't massive in terms of raw money, a few $1,000s, give or take, but it was enough to warrant a routine inquiry. Keokuk, Iowa, was a town of just over 12,000 people, sitting at the intersection of the Mississippi River and a long, slow forgetting. Once a bustling river port, by the 1990s, it had settled into a state of pleasant decay, a town where everybody knew your name, your dog's name, and your father's army unit. The post office was no different. A two-story brick building with aging fluorescent lights, it operated on muscle memory. Mail got sorted, pensions got delivered, and in the quiet, cluttered mailroom downstairs, a man named Donald Ray Mercer sat at a desk beneath a jittering ceiling fan, quietly committing one of the most methodical embezzlement schemes the USPS had ever seen. Who was Donald Mercer? To most of Keokuk, Donald was invisible. At 52, he'd worked for the Postal Service nearly half his life. He was the kind of employee every bureaucracy quietly depends on, always early, rarely sick, and never the source of office gossip. Divorced, no kids, he rented a modest apartment above a shuttered barber shop and drove a 12-year-old Pontiac that coughed in the winter. He didn't drink, didn't travel, didn't even attend the office Christmas parties, though he'd always leave a tin of homemade fudge in the break room with a note, "Enjoy D." It wasn't that Donald was antisocial. He simply moved through the world without ripples. And that's what made the crime so effective. The stamp loophole. At the time, postmasters were allowed to order stamps in bulk for anticipated demand. Once received, the stamps were logged, stored in a locked safe, and released as needed. Accounting procedures were paper-based and notoriously loose, relying on handwritten logs and monthly inventory sheets reconciled by hand. Donald had discovered a flaw. There was no centralized system tracking where a stamp went once it was received. A sheet of 100 stamps valued at $29 could be sold, lost, misplaced, or stolen, and no digital red flag would be triggered. So he began small. A single extra order one month. Then a quiet manipulation of the inventory logs the next. He would receive stamp shipments that had never actually arrived, forge the delivery receipts, and sell the excess stamps on the gray market primarily to out-of-state collectors and small mail-order businesses who paid cash and didn't ask questions. The beauty of the scam lay in its slowness. It took nearly 8 years before anyone noticed. The auditor's visit. When the discrepancy report landed on the desk of field auditor Nancy Crowell, she didn't think much of it. It wasn't her first odd-order volume case. Sometimes clerks got overeager. Sometimes small-town postmasters liked to pad inventory for local fairs or tax season. She scheduled a site visit for May 9, 1994. Nancy was precise, sharp-eyed, and exceptionally good at math in her head. She arrived in Keokuk with a clipboard, a stern tone, and a polite refusal of coffee. Within hours, she noticed irregularities. Missing serial numbers on several stamp stock forms. Incomplete transfer sheets between the main safe and the customer service desk. Monthly stamp usage numbers that had flatlined despite increasing orders. When she asked for the original shipment logs, Donald was the one who retrieved them. He smiled, apologized for the dust, offered to reprint some of the older forms that had gotten wet in the basement. Nancy didn't buy it. The investigation begins. Her report triggered a formal investigation from the USPS Office of Inspector General. For 6 months, forensic accountants pored through old inventory sheets, traced shipping invoices, and cross-referenced cash drawer logs. What they found was staggering. Over an 8-year period, Donald had embezzled more than $312,000 in stamps adjusting for inflation, over $500,000 today. The transactions were spread across hundreds of fake entries, ghost shipments, and altered reconciliation sheets. The method was consistent. Donald would submit a legitimate order. He'd slightly inflate the number. He'd doctor the physical receipts when the stamps arrived. He'd sell the overage to one of several contacts in Missouri and Illinois, all cash deals, no paper trail. The investigation might have stalled there until one of the buyers turned up dead. the stamp dealer in St. Charles. Walter Jean Crandall was a retired schoolteacher and part-time stamp collector who ran a mail-order catalog out of his basement in St. Charles, Missouri. He was one of Donald's biggest clients, regularly receiving bulk shipments of unused first-class stamps at slightly below face value. In November of 1994, Crandall was found dead in his home heart attack, natural causes. But during the estate probate, his son uncovered a cache of sealed envelopes, dozens of them, containing unused, mint-condition stamps stacked in tidy bundles. Alongside them was a notebook labeled D. Mercer K. Inside, dates, weights, and cash values. A crude ledger but damning enough. The son, unsure of the legality, contacted the USPS. Within a week, Donald Mercer was quietly placed under surveillance. The arrest. Donald was arrested on January 6, 1995, without incident. He was sitting at his desk, sorting incoming business reply mail. When agents approached him, he didn't argue, didn't ask why. He simply removed his reading glasses, folded them into his shirt pocket, and said, "You found the notebook, didn't you?" He waived his right to an attorney. During the interview, he confessed to the entire scheme from its inception to his methods of laundering the cash. But he never named any living buyers. They didn't know it was stolen, or they didn't care, doesn't matter now. What struck investigators wasn't just the breadth of the crime, it was Donald's calmness. There were no delusions of grandeur, no justifications, no anger. Just a quiet, tired man who said he wanted to live a little more comfortably. When asked what he did with the money, his answer was almost disappointing. Groceries, rent, replaced the shocks in the car, bought a recliner once, gave some to the church under a fake name, nothing special. The trial that was. Because Donald had fully confessed and the evidence was airtight, prosecutors offered a plea deal: 5 years in federal prison, reduced to 3 with good behavior. Donald accepted without hesitation. He was sentenced on April 3, 1995. In court, he wore a worn brown suit. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Donald simply said, "I'm sorry for embarrassing the office. I always liked the work." There was no press coverage, no public outrage, just a page 3 column in the Keokuk Daily Gate City titled, "Mailroom Employee Pleads Guilty in Stamp Fraud Case." Aftermath and reflection. Donald was released in 1998 and quietly moved to Cedar Rapids, where he lived under a low-profile name and worked part-time at a hardware store. He died in 2012, no next of kin, no obituary. But his case became something of a quiet legend among postal inspectors. Training sessions would mention it as a model of low-exposure internal fraud and a cautionary tale about systemic complacency. Keokuk's post office implemented a digital inventory system shortly after. Nancy Crowell retired in 2004 and later remarked in an interview, "He wasn't stealing for boats or women or cars. He was stealing for a better recliner. That's the part that still gets me." The echo in the system. For all the sophistication of modern fraud schemes, Donald's crime remains oddly human. He exploited no technology, led no conspiracy, and didn't live lavishly. He simply found a weakness in the routine and used it to carve out a slightly softer life. A life of quiet fraud, quiet remorse, and a quiet ending. And so we're left with the kind of question that doesn't make headlines, but lingers all the same. If someone steals for comfort rather than greed, does that make the crime any less criminal? When Donald Ray Mercer was quietly transferred to a low-security federal prison in Oxford, Wisconsin, his case file closed in Keokuk. Officially, the investigation had run its course. The USPS had its man, the stolen assets were cataloged, and the post office had installed a new digital tracking system for stamp inventory. But for Inspector Calvin Green, the file was incomplete. Green, a mid-career fraud investigator stationed in Springfield, Illinois, had joined the latter stages of the case. Something about it didn't sit right. Mercer's complete confession was too clean, too solitary. Green had seen enough scams to know even the most methodical grifters rarely operate in a vacuum. And there was one detail that kept tugging at him: the buyers. If Mercer was unloading tens of thousands of dollars worth of first-class stamps, someone had to be facilitating those sales not just once, but repeatedly, and often across state lines. So Green kept digging, long after the case had gone cold. The Stamp Whisper Network. It turned out there was a name for this kind of operation in niche postal circles: quiet flipping. Stamp collectors and small-volume mail-order businesses, especially before the rise of internet marketplaces, often relied on under-the-table supply chains to acquire stamps at a discount. These weren't rare collectibles but ordinary, valid postage. They just came in bulk and cheaper than face value. Green traced several of Mercer's recorded shipments using the Crandall notebook found after the stamp dealer's death to P.O. boxes and storefronts in Missouri and southern Illinois. Many were defunct. A few were tied to real businesses. But one stood out: a small office supply reseller in Quincy, Illinois, operating under the name Mid-River Mailing Services. It had no website, no retail storefront, just a business registration, a single phone line, and a suite number in a beige strip mall tucked between a liquor store and a carpet cleaning franchise. Green paid them a visit. The man in Suite 8B. The office was dusty, windowless, and smelled faintly of toner, ink, and menthol. Behind the cluttered desk sat Gordon Blaine, a short man with suspenders, bifocals, and the guarded disposition of someone who had practiced evasion as a lifestyle. When Green introduced himself, Blaine offered a tight smile. "All my stamps are legal, if that's what you're here about." Green showed him a scan from the Crandall notebook, the date, the weight of a package, and a scribbled initial GB. Blaine didn't flinch. Walter liked to make lists. He was old school like that. "Doesn't mean the packages came from me." Green wasn't expecting a confession. He was testing the edges. He asked how Blaine acquired his stamps. Bulk liquidation auctions, overruns, postal promotions. Blaine shrugged. A little of this, a little of that. There were no invoices, no receipts, just a wall safe and a card table covered in rolls of forever stamps. Green didn't have probable cause for a search, but something told him Blaine was the missing link, the facilitator. A hidden economy. Investigating low-level postal fraud wasn't glamorous. There were no wiretaps, no sting operations, but Green had learned to follow the money in unusual ways. Through a Freedom of Information request, he obtained old cash deposit records from Blaine's bank. Over a 4-year span, Blaine's tiny, one-man operation deposited over $220,000 in cash, all in round number increments, nearly all under $10,000, to avoid IRS currency transaction reports. He filed 1099s, paid taxes, ran a clean business on paper. But there was no inventory. When Green cross-referenced outgoing shipments from Blaine's P.O. box, he found hundreds of flat-rate mailers, all addressed to small-town post offices, mail-order business owners, and, in at least 2 cases, known philatelic dealers in Florida and New York. The shipments were consistent. Each included between $500 and $2,000 worth of valid U.S. postage. No invoices. No branding. Payment instructions by phone or money order. The operation was careful, silent, and entirely built on the kind of low-risk anonymity that let the whole thing remain invisible to most federal radars. How it worked. Green built a timeline based on the records he could find. Mercer would doctor USPS inventory logs and order extra stamps. He'd receive the full shipment, while skimming off a portion before they entered the customer-facing inventory. He'd package the skimmed portion, neatly stacked sheets or coils, and mail them to Blaine. Blaine would then redistribute those stamps to his own buyer network, often marking them down 5–8% below face value, enticing bulk purchasers and small business operators. The profit margins weren't enormous, but they were safe, and given the stamp's validity, buyers weren't worried about legality. It was, in essence, a black market economy built around legitimate postage. Mercer's take was small compared to what Blaine likely made over the years. And unlike Mercer, Blaine had never written a single incriminating note or touched the stamps before delivery. The postcard from Oxford. While Green compiled his findings, Mercer, then 2 years into his sentence, sent a postcard to his old supervisor at the Keokuk post office. It was polite, unsigned, but clearly him. Oxford isn't so bad. Books are free and so is the time. Tell Martha the fudge recipe still works. Hope the new safe's working better than the old one. Green caught wind of it and petitioned to interview Mercer at the prison. To his surprise, Mercer agreed. The prison interview. It was a cold, gray day in late October when Green sat across from Donald Mercer in a visiting room with faded linoleum floors and humming fluorescents. Mercer looked thinner, older, but just as calm. Green didn't mince words. "I know about Blaine." Mercer gave a noncommittal shrug. "I know a lot of things too. Doesn't mean I can do anything with them." Green leaned in. "You had the cleanest confession I've ever read, but you left him out. Why?" Mercer took a long pause, then finally, "Because he didn't steal anything." Green raised an eyebrow. "He laundered stolen stamps." "He bought stamps," Mercer said flatly. "What he thought about them, that's on him." Green asked if Mercer ever thought of walking away, ending the operation. Mercer smiled just faintly. "I always figured it would end one day, just didn't know when." He never admitted Blaine's involvement directly, but the implication was clear. Mercer considered himself the thief. The rest were just participants in inevitability. Legal gray, ethical grayer. Despite Green's compiled evidence, federal prosecutors declined to pursue Blaine. There was no direct link, no paper trail, no confession, no traceable payments. The stamp reselling, while murky, wasn't explicitly illegal if the stamps were believed to be obtained legally. The gray market was messy, but not prosecutable. Blaine continued operations for another 5 years before quietly retiring. Green eventually closed the supplemental report. Donald's quiet legacy. Donald Mercer served just under 3 years. Upon release, he returned not to Keokuk, but to Cedar Rapids, where he worked under an assumed name at a supply warehouse and lived in a modest duplex. He never reoffended. In 2010, 2 years before his death, he mailed a donation $5,000 in cashier's checks split between 3 small-town post offices, each labeled, "For the window clerks, they do the hard work." The origin was never confirmed, but the handwriting matched his known samples. The system then and now. The USPS eventually rolled out its inventory control program, a centralized, barcode-based tracking system that rendered Mercer's style of fraud nearly impossible. The days of handwritten logs and unlocked safes were over. But among veteran investigators, the case still circulates as a cautionary tale. That quiet fraud is often the most successful kind, not because it avoids detection, but because it doesn't look like fraud at all. It looks like loyalty, routine, trust. And that's what makes it dangerous. When Donald Mercer died in 2012, he left behind no will, no surviving family, and no one to claim his belongings. The modest contents of his rented duplex, a few worn shirts, paperbacks, A coffee tin of quarters, and a recliner with a blanket folded neatly over the back were boxed up by a city clerk and marked for auction or disposal. His name never made the news. And yet, inside federal training manuals and internal fraud memos, the story of the Keokuk embezzler is still quietly cited. Not for its drama or scale, but because it was the kind of crime no one noticed, carried out by someone no one watched, over a span of years that no one remembered with particular clarity. This final chapter isn't about criminal brilliance. It's about the danger of assumptions, the fragility of oversight, and the cost of quiet trust. Mercer's last interview. 2 weeks before his release in 1998, Donald Mercer sat down with a USPS internal affairs historian. The conversation was meant for archival use, an oral record of how a breach that lasted nearly a decade could happen within one of the nation's most heavily structured federal institutions. The interview was never published, but the transcript still sits in a closed-access training repository. The highlights are unnervingly calm. "I never thought of myself as a criminal, just someone who found a crack in the wall." He described his motivations as simple, even dull. "It wasn't about hurting anyone. I had no kids, no bills I couldn't pay. I just liked the idea that I could do something big without anyone noticing." When asked why he confessed, his answer was just as mundane. "I got tired, and honestly, I was curious what would happen." A crack in the culture. At its core, Donald's case wasn't about stamps. It was about the blind spots of routine. The people in Keokuk trusted him because he was always there, always early, always polite, never late, never loud. And that's what made the fraud so sustainable. Mercer didn't need to hack a system. He simply blended into it, manipulated gaps in oversight that no one thought needed watching. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was hiding in plain, bureaucratic daylight. When he submitted altered stamp orders, no one questioned them. When he moved product between internal safes, no one double-checked. When he forged delivery confirmations, they were accepted as gospel because Donald doesn't make mistakes. The system didn't fail because it was broken. It failed because it was too comfortable. The human cost of quiet crimes. The USPS ultimately recouped some of the losses through insurance mechanisms and updated internal controls. No one lost a pension. No one's mail went undelivered. But Green, the investigator who stayed with the case long after everyone else walked away, always noted the intangible losses. The breach damaged morale at the Keokuk office. It led to overcorrections, additional checks, surprise audits, and policy revisions that sowed quiet distrust among staff. Internal camaraderie was never quite the same. And there was Martha, the longtime window clerk who'd always brought in baked goods, who'd once said to Green, "He was like a chair you've sat on for 20 years. You never expect it to break." She retired early, partly out of exhaustion from the fallout. Beyond Keokuk, Mercer's arrest and confession led to several similar investigations across the Midwest. While no exact duplicates were found, his scheme triggered audits that uncovered a misallocated stamp order in Michigan that had gone unaccounted for due to clerical errors, a suspended employee in Indiana who'd been pocketing cash in exchange for off-the-books money orders, a Chicago distribution hub discrepancy that led to a separate investigation of counterfeit postal meters. None matched the scope or subtlety of Mercer's operation, but they all carried the same DNA: crimes of invisibility, facilitated not by technical genius but by institutional apathy. The system rebuilt. In the wake of Mercer's exposure, the USPS overhauled large parts of its inventory and fraud detection processes. By 2000, all stamp orders were traceable via centralized databases. Each stamp shipment had serialized digital tracking and verification scanning. Internal transfers required dual authentication with independent sign-offs. Employee training incorporated case studies like Mercer to highlight internal threats. And quietly, in some rooms, Donald Mercer's name was still spoken not with anger, but with weary curiosity. The man who taught us what trust can cost. Stamp collectors and the legacy of laundering. While Mercer's fraud involved mostly utilitarian postage, the incident inadvertently opened scrutiny on a more peculiar industry, the stamp resale world. In the early 2000s, several investigations focused on rebundling operations. Stamp sheets resold at discount via estate sales, bankruptcy liquidations, and occasionally diverted institutional shipments. Investigators began looking more closely at gray market vendors like Gordon Blaine. Though Blaine was never charged, his operation gradually shrank. He retired in 2005 and reportedly moved to Arizona, where he sold his remaining stock to a dealer in Tempe. A strange footnote followed in 2007. One of Blaine's sold sheets turned out to be counterfeit, printed with a replicated but incorrect micro-pattern under UV light. To this day, no one knows if Mercer ever dealt with counterfeits, but it raised a final, unanswered possibility. Was Donald always in control? Or had someone, somewhere along the way, used him as a shield? The final account. The Office of Inspector General's summary report on the case concluded with a quiet observation. The Keokuk case serves as a reminder that systems must never assume infallibility, particularly when those operating within them are invisible by design or demeanor. In other words, it wasn't the size of the crime that made it dangerous. It was how easily it happened and how long it lasted. All without a single late arrival or day off. A bench in Keokuk. There's one other footnote worth mentioning. In 2015, a local postal union, mostly retirees, funded a public bench installation just down the street from the Keokuk post office. It was simple, wood and steel, overlooking a quiet stretch of sidewalk. The plaque read, "To those who kept the mail moving, even when no one was watching." Some saw it as a tribute to hardworking, unseen laborers. But those who'd worked with Donald Mercer weren't so sure. Final reflections. Donald Mercer didn't crash economies or destroy livelihoods. He didn't carry a gun or a grudge. His crime didn't make national news. It didn't even make the local radio more than once. And yet, his story echoes for anyone who's ever wondered. What damage can be done when no one's paying attention, not out of negligence, but out of faith? In a world that often lionizes explosive, high-profile criminality, Mercer's legacy is quieter, more dangerous. He proved that trust, when left unchecked, can be the perfect camouflage for betrayal. Story 3. The Vanishing Tax Auditor of Pinal County. On a sun-baked Thursday in July 2003, David Wexler, a 46-year-old tax compliance auditor with the Arizona Department of Revenue, clocked out of his satellite office in Casa Grande at exactly 5:06 p.m. He waved to the receptionist, loaded his briefcase into his beige Toyota Corolla, and drove south toward his modest two-bedroom home in Eloy, a 20-minute ride along Route 87. He never arrived. By Friday morning, his desk remained untouched. His supervisor, Sharon Vasquez, called his home, no answer. At 10:32 a.m., when Wexler failed to appear for a scheduled audit of a construction subcontractor in Coolidge, she reported him missing. Local police found his car later that afternoon, parked in the shade of a cottonwood tree near a dry wash about 4 miles off the main road. The keys were in the ignition. The briefcase was missing. So was Wexler. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no tire marks indicating another vehicle, just a government employee gone clean, quiet, and entirely inexplicable. Who was David Wexler? To colleagues, David was the kind of civil servant who embodied quiet precision. He kept his pens aligned, his forms crisp, and his desk free of clutter. He was unmarried, childless, and lived alone with a rescue greyhound named Marvin. His most social interactions came during Monday morning staff meetings and the occasional potluck. He audited small businesses for underreported income, improper deductions, and sales tax evasion. It was tedious, methodical work far from glamorous, even in government circles, but David loved it. He wasn't flashy. He didn't carry a badge or a gun. His most aggressive tool was a stapler. And yet, within a week of his disappearance, 3 agencies would open inquiries not because of who David was, but because of who he had been auditing. The last audit trail. Wexler's caseload was standard A rotating mix of small businesses flagged for anomalies. But when his computer was forensically examined, investigators found a hidden folder on his desktop, labeled with an innocuous title, Client Re-Reviews. Inside were subfolders for 17 businesses, most of which Wexler had not been formally assigned to audit. Some had already been cleared, others were outside his jurisdiction. One name stood out: Sonoran Custom Materials, LLC. Registered to a warehouse in Maricopa, the company produced gravel, recycled asphalt, and decorative stone for local contractors. On paper, the business was clean, low profits, steady operations, quarterly filings submitted on time. But Wexler's notes told another story. In a PDF labeled Unreported Volume Crosscheck, he listed discrepancies between Sonoran's self-reported output and municipal records of construction materials delivered to several sites. The numbers didn't add up. By Wexler's estimation, the company had underreported more than $1.8 million in taxable sales over a 5-year period. No formal complaint had been filed. No upper-level alerts had been triggered, which meant Wexler had been pursuing the lead on his own. Why go rogue? When investigators interviewed Wexler's coworkers, they were puzzled. He had never broken protocol. He never took risks. He was, in Sharon Vasquez's words, the human equivalent of a safety belt. But one colleague, junior auditor Leo McKinnon, recalled a lunchroom conversation 2 weeks before the disappearance. David had mentioned being bothered by a case. He said something about patterns that didn't make sense, and that someone was trying not to be noticed. Leo hadn't thought much of it, but in hindsight, the tone had been different, more tense than curious. A company with no face. Sonoran Custom Materials, LLC was hard to pin down. It had a functioning address, a small office, and 4 employees listed on payroll. But when agents visited the site, they found only 2 workers present, both subcontracted laborers with limited English and no knowledge of company operations. The registered owner, David F. Lamb, had a P.O. box and a disconnected phone number. The address listed for corporate filings traced back to a vacant lot in Apache Junction. No utilities, no records of rent, no Lamb in public directories. It was a shell. And Wexler had known it. The warehouse camera. 1 week after the investigation began, a break came via a traffic camera located near a gas station 2 miles from where Wexler's car had been found. At 5:37 p.m., roughly 30 minutes after Wexler left his office, the camera captured a vehicle matching his Corolla driving westbound on a frontage road. The timestamp placed it several miles past the turnoff to his house. At 5:52 p.m., the same camera picked up a second car trailing behind, a dark green Ford Explorer with no visible plates. Investigators ran the image through enhancement software and located a partial ID, a dealership plate frame from a used car lot in Florence, Arizona. It was their first lead. The green Explorer. The vehicle, as it turned out, had been sold in cash 2 weeks prior to a man using the name Frank Devon, no license, no insurance, and a California phone number that was no longer in service. But dealership staff remembered the man. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, work boots, quiet, said he needed a truck for hauling. Surveillance video was too blurry for facial recognition, but the DMV facial index flagged a similar image tied to a Devin Francis LeClaire, a former contractor turned private security subcontractor with no known ties to tax work or revenue services. But LeClaire had worked briefly, years earlier, for a materials contractor in Maricopa County, one that sublet its equipment yard to Sonoran Custom Materials. The threads were thin, but they were beginning to tangle. No body, no crime. With no body, no signs of violence, and no confirmed witness sightings, prosecutors were cautious. The official designation remained, missing person, suspicious circumstances. But internally, the Department of Revenue's legal counsel admitted that Wexler's disappearance had all the hallmarks of retaliation. Someone likely associated with Sonoran had discovered his independent review. Perhaps he had asked too many questions. Perhaps he had gotten too close. But without a body, without a confession, and without hard evidence of a crime, there could be no arrests. The investigation slowed. The letter. Then came the letter. In September 2003, nearly 2 months after Wexler's disappearance, Sharon Vasquez received a plain white envelope at her office, postmarked from Tucson. Inside, a single sheet of copy paper. Typed. He was digging into something bigger than he realized. They don't just move gravel. If you push, more will vanish. Let him go. No name, no signature. The envelope bore no fingerprints. FBI analysts later determined the typeface came from a standard word processor. The envelope and paper were unremarkable bulk office supplies, widely available. But the phrasing "more will vanish" suggested threat, not to Wexler, to others. The letter was enough to prompt federal involvement. Behind the gravel. In November 2003, a joint task force quietly opened a financial crimes investigation into Sonoran Custom Materials and several related LLCs operating in southern Arizona. What they found was far more than unreported gravel. The shell companies appeared to be money laundering fronts filtering illicit income from cash-based businesses through fake construction purchases. Bulk materials orders were used to explain large cash flows. Most of the companies filed minimal taxes. All had ties to absentee owners with unverifiable identities. No charges were brought, no press releases were issued. But within 6 months, Sonoran shut down. Its warehouse was vacated overnight. And the Wexler investigation was officially transferred to the Cold Case Division. Marvin. One of the most human footnotes of the case comes not from government files, but from the county animal shelter. Wexler's dog, Marvin A. Quiet, aging greyhound, had been picked up the night David disappeared. A neighbor reported hearing him barking alone in the house. He was found dehydrated but unharmed. Sharon Vasquez adopted him. He lived another 3 years, frequently seen lounging behind the reception desk at the Department of Revenue, wearing a blue bandana and napping through audits. For the staff, he was a gentle, living reminder. When David Wexler disappeared in the summer of 2003, few outside the Arizona Department of Revenue knew his name. But behind closed doors, a quiet tension gripped the state's internal audit offices. Compliance officers across the region began reviewing their own caseloads, quietly double-checking anything that might have once passed as routine. Some cases were shuffled, some quietly disappeared, and whispers of Wexler's independent investigation into Sonoran Custom Materials, LLC, became a cautionary tale not for overstepping policy, but for probing too deeply into something that wasn't supposed to be noticed. But not everyone was content to leave the trail cold. In January 2004, 8 months after Wexler's disappearance, DOR internal investigator Maribel Ortiz reopened her own unofficial inquiry. And what she found peeled back the edges of a system more compromised than anyone had realized. A new eye on the paperwork. Ortiz, a former IRS fraud analyst turned state revenue investigator, had worked with Wexler in the Casa Grande office briefly in 2001. They weren't close, but she respected him. He was the kind of guy who noticed inconsistencies most of us skimmed past. He didn't have instincts. He had patterns. Her decision to reopen the trail was unofficial, kept off the formal docket, and conducted on her own time. She began by combing through Sonoran sister LLCs, companies that had shared addresses, business agents, or federal tax IDs linked to the same PO boxes or non-functioning phone lines. She found 6 companies tied to Sonoran by overlapping metadata including Desert Transit Aggregates, Verd Earthworks LLC, Gila Rock Solutions, Southwestern Bulk Processing, Crimson Stripping Co., AGM Transport and Reclamation. Each had declared modest quarterly revenues generally under $200,000, yet filed massive deductions for fuel, equipment maintenance, and material purchases. In nearly every case, the expenditures exceeded reported income, and all had received state tax refunds. Small ones, just enough to avoid scrutiny. It was like they were testing the system, Ortiz would later say, just little enough to avoid heat, but enough to matter. Wexler had been following that same scent. The shared signature. One of the most telling discoveries came from an application form filed with the Arizona Department of Transportation, a routine vehicle registration document for a commercial gravel hauler, submitted by Desert Transit Aggregates. The signature on the form read, D.F. Lamb, the same name as the supposed owner of Sonoran Custom Materials. But Ortiz cross-referenced that with a DMV record scan. On a separate, earlier form, the signature of D.F. Lamb appeared in slightly different handwriting. She had it analyzed. The conclusion: 2 different people had signed forms under the same name, which meant David F. Lamb wasn't a person, he was a name being passed around. A paper phantom, warehouse surveillance, or the lack thereof. Ortiz drove to the old Sonoran warehouse in Maricopa. By now, the business had shut down. The signage was gone, the windows dark, and a large metal chain padlocked the front gate. She inquired with neighboring units, including a tile distributor and a mobile truck repair company. None recalled seeing Wexler before his disappearance. But one man, Luis Figueroa, a security guard employed by a third-party lot service, remembered something odd. One night, maybe a week before that guy went missing, I saw a car parked outside that warehouse, lights off, engine running, sat there for almost an hour. Luis couldn't see who was inside, but the vehicle he described. A beige Corolla, no front plate, and a sun-faded bumper sticker. It matched Wexler's car. The hidden folder. Back at headquarters, Ortiz made a breakthrough. While combing through the backup archives from Wexler's state-issued laptop, she found a password-protected zip folder buried in the user temp directory, a place most forensic analysts wouldn't have prioritized. The password was simple: Marvin 98, the name of Wexler's greyhound, and the year he was adopted. Inside the folder were 5 Excel files, 1 PDF, a JPEG. Each spreadsheet was a side-by-side ledger, comparing self-reported earnings from the suspect LLCs with shipping manifests from city construction records, fuel usage reports, and equipment rental logs, all data Wexler had quietly collected by sending open records requests using his personal email address. In total, he'd calculated over $2.3 million in unreported taxable income, across 4 years, all spread across 6 businesses. The PDF was a written memo draft titled Preliminary Fraud Scheme Indicators, Sonoran Materials Network. But it was the JPEG that chilled Ortiz. It was a photo of the Sonoran warehouse, grainy and slightly askew, as if taken from a car window. Sitting outside the loading bay was a green Ford Explorer, tinted windows, no plates. The vanishing subcontractor. The same green Explorer, the one seen following Wexler's car in traffic camera footage, had been linked to a man named Devin LeClaire, a shadowy figure connected to former industrial cleanup projects across the Southwest. Ortiz pulled his file. LeClaire had worked under contract for 3 years with a now-defunct land remediation firm. After the firm dissolved, he fell off the employment grid. No new filings, no tax returns, just a smattering of DMV activity suggesting he moved around frequently. His last known address: an RV park in Eloy, 3 miles from where Wexler's Corolla had been found. Ortiz drove out herself. The lot was gone, bulldozed for a new development. No records of tenants had been preserved, just a flattened patch of land and a faded signpost. Whistle in the silence. Ortiz compiled her findings into an unofficial report and brought them to her supervisor, asking to reopen the Wexler file formally. She was told, politely but firmly, to stand down. "You're chasing ghosts, Marable. The AG's office isn't interested in a case with no body and no concrete target." But she'd been doing this too long. That same week, she met privately with a contact in the Arizona Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit. She handed him the zip folder, her notes, and a timeline of Wexler's last known actions. He listened, promised to escalate. And within 3 weeks, the AG's office shuttered the investigation. No explanation, no press release. Ortiz was reassigned. A quiet visit. In March 2004, nearly 9 months after Wexler's disappearance, Sharon Vasquez received a visitor at the Casa Grande office. A man in his late 40s, wearing a business casual windbreaker and dark slacks. He didn't give a name. He asked one question: did Wexler ever mention Sonoran in an official report? Sharon said no. The man nodded, thanked her, and left. The security footage of the lobby that day was later found to have been recording over itself improperly, a glitch or a deletion. No one ever identified the visitor. Where the trail goes cold. By 2006, all 6 shell companies tied to Sonoran had shut down. 3 of the PO boxes were closed. The others remained unused. No charges were filed. Wexler's case remains officially open. The AG's office refers all inquiries to the Department of Public Safety Cold Case Division, which, as of their last statement, maintains Wexler as a missing person presumed deceased under suspicious circumstances. No suspect has been named. No remains have been found. The audit that might have changed everything. Wexler's final memo, the PDF titled Preliminary Fraud Scheme Indicators, ends with a haunting paragraph. It is possible these companies operate in deliberate coordination to avoid detection by dividing earnings and liabilities. If not stopped, this model could be replicated statewide. The threat is not the money, it's the precedent of silence. In April 2005, nearly 2 years after David Wexler's disappearance, a confidential memo circulated through select departments within the Arizona state government. It didn't reference Wexler by name. It didn't reference Sonoran custom materials. It wasn't about missing persons or audit flags or green explorers. It was titled, Indicators of Structured Commercial Fraud via Layered Shell Operations in Desert Development Regions. Buried within its second appendix was a short case study, anonymized but familiar to anyone who had followed the Wexler case closely. It outlined a pattern. high-volume materials companies claiming low revenue, cross-use of PO boxes and agent names, revenue suppression through inflated deduction filings, a sudden cessation of operations after indirect state scrutiny. The memo was meant as an internal reference, not an investigation, but its quiet acknowledgement confirmed what many already suspected. David Wexler had discovered something real, and someone had made sure he wouldn't say another word about it. The last known account. In 2010, 5 years after the internal memo, Maribel Ortiz, by then no longer working with the Department of Revenue, gave a private, off-the-record interview for a graduate thesis project at Arizona State University on internal fraud detection. She spoke with the condition that her name be withheld. In the interview, she recalled a final conversation she had in late 2004 with a source inside the Arizona AG's office, someone she referred to only as B. I asked him if they were ever going to follow through on the case. He just shook his head and said, "This is bigger than the tax code." When pressed, Ortiz said the AG's office had been quietly advised. She wouldn't say by whom that any further pursuit of the shell companies Wexler had flagged could interfere with active federal interests. Those interests were never named. No federal agencies ever issued statements or subpoenas related to the case, but documents show that several employees tied to the LLCs disappeared from state employment registries around the same time. One of them had been listed as a contractor for a materials transport firm in Nogales. Another had filed tax paperwork in 2003 but never filed again. They simply stopped existing on paper. Just like Wexler. David Wexler's house. The home he left behind in Eloy was eventually cleared out by the state. With no will and no next of kin, it became county property and was later sold at auction. But in the attic, hidden behind a loose panel, the new homeowner found a faded composition notebook, the kind used in high school chemistry classes. Inside were handwritten notes, Wexler's handwriting summarizing audit calculations, discrepancies, and a list of 5 businesses he intended to revisit, despite them having been cleared by his superiors. One entry, dated June 16, 2003, read, "Still think they're using Sonoran as a sinkhole. Question is, for what tax shelter, cash conversion, something else? Marvin knows more than I do. He at least gets dinner." It was the last dated entry. The missing contractor. In 2012, a former private security contractor, Devin LeClaire, the man suspected to have followed Wexler the night he disappeared, resurfaced in Tucson under a different name. He'd applied for a commercial truck driver's license, but was flagged during the fingerprinting process when biometric anomalies triggered a secondary scan. He was brought in for questioning under the alias Derek Cole. Agents confirmed the match to LeClaire through DMV photos and a scar noted in earlier reports. But when asked about Wexler, LeClaire simply denied knowing anything. "I don't know who that is. I've never been to Eloy." No charges were filed. The name David Wexler never appeared in the interrogation records. 3 months later, LeClaire left the state. He hasn't been seen since. A system that chose silence. The final Department of Revenue internal audit, released quietly in 2006, made only the following note regarding Wexler. Auditor failed to adhere to formal investigative protocol, pursued personal inquiries outside of assigned casework. While initiative is commendable, procedures must be followed to ensure legal integrity and personal safety. That one paragraph, buried in a report of over 200 pages, was the only official acknowledgement that Wexler's pursuit of the Sonoran fraud network had ever occurred. The report did not name Sonoran or any of the related shell companies. It did not mention that some of those same companies had been issued over $300,000 in collective state tax refunds over a 6-year period. and it made no reference to the confidential memo circulated a year prior that mirrored Wexler's findings nearly point for point. Unfinished threads. A few pieces of the case remain unanswered to this day. No financial link was ever established between Wexler and any of the companies. There was no motive to plant false information. The green Ford Explorer, caught on the traffic camera trailing Wexler's Corolla, was never found. No remains, no clothing, no briefcase. Marvin the Greyhound lived out the rest of his days with Sharon Vasquez, who retired in 2007 and moved to Flagstaff. She declined all interview requests, offering only, "He was a good man. I wish I'd paid closer attention." The cost of curiosity. Those close to the case believe Wexler wasn't the target of a grand conspiracy, not in the Hollywood sense. Rather, he had wandered too close to a systemic vulnerability, a cluster of semi-legitimate businesses used to move money in ways that benefited entities no one wanted to publicly name. And in doing so, he created a problem that couldn't be handled through policy or reprimand. It had to be handled with disappearance. What Wexler left behind. There's something profoundly haunting about a man who lived his life by the rules, who never pushed boundaries, never skipped steps, never raised his voice being erased for following the truth just a little too far. Wexler didn't chase corruption for glory. He didn't want a headline. He wanted consistency, integrity. He died or was disappeared for doing his job too well. Final reflections. The legacy of David Wexler isn't a trial or a headline or a recovered body. It's a file that never reached the proper inbox. It's a green SUV never identified. It's a briefcase that vanished into dust and memory. And it's the quiet understanding, shared among a handful of state investigators, that someone, somewhere made a decision. Let him go. And no one asked why. Story 4. Whispers from Room 308, The Motel Ledger Murders. The Sun Drop Motel in Lebanon, Missouri was a fading dot on the map, a time-worn, 18-room roadside stop along the old Route 66 corridor, most often used by traveling salesmen, cash-strapped tourists, or those drifting between something and nothing. The lobby always smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and cigarette smoke. The sign buzzed at night, flickering a tired promise: vacancy. On the evening of March 12, 1991, a man checked into room 308 using the name John Carver. He paid in cash, carried a small duffel bag, and requested a room in the back, farthest from the front desk. The clerk didn't think much of it. People passing through liked privacy. Carver had no ID on file, not unusual in an era before digital systems or required scans. The next morning, a maid knocked to clean the room. No answer. By checkout time, still nothing. The manager, a retired trucker named Don Stidham, let himself in. Inside, silence, a cold cup of coffee, and a body slumped over the small table by the window. The victim. John Carver was a fake name. Fingerprints would later identify him as Joseph Bernard Chasson, a 62-year-old retired accountant from Tulsa, Oklahoma. No active warrants, no known enemies, widowed, semi-reclusive. His last known public appearance was at a library fundraiser 6 weeks earlier. He'd left no note, no suicide materials, the cause of death, blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. He had been hit once, hard, with a rounded object, likely a tire iron or large flashlight, and died almost instantly. There were no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, no money missing, no valuables taken. The door had been locked from the inside. The ledger. On the table where his body slumped, police found a small, leather-bound motel ledger book. Not the one used by the front desk that remained behind the counter, full of scribbles and smudged signatures. This was something else. Inside were pages of meticulous notes. Dates. Motel names. Room numbers. Name some real, some aliases. Payments usually in cash. Amounts that didn't match standard rates. Each page followed the same structure. Shasson had been logging transactions at low-end motels across 3 states, Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma. It wasn't clear what he was tracking or why. But the final entry, dated March 11, read, SD38, $120 paid up front, no ID required, same man as Mina, confirmed. SD was assumed to mean sun drop. 308 was his room. Mina likely referred to Mina, Arkansas, a town tied historically to various smuggling routes. The note sent a chill through the investigators. Because just 8 months earlier in Mina, a motel housekeeper had found a guest dead in his room under similar circumstances. Blunt force trauma. No ID. Name used. James Connor. A name that also appeared in Shasson's ledger 3 pages earlier. The pattern emerges. As detectives pieced together the information in the ledger, they found 6 other incidents that seemed connected, all occurring over a 3-year span. All involving small-town motels, all involving victims who had used aliases, and all with quietly closed cases. In each instance, the victim was male, aged 50-70. There were signs of cash transactions. The victims had obscure financial histories: accountants, bookkeepers, retired clerks. The injuries were similar, single blunt force blows. Police found no clear motive. And in at least 3, a ledger or notebook was missing from the scene. Now, in room 308, they had one. But not an answer, only more questions. Who was Shasson really? Joseph Bernard Shasson was born in Muskogee, served in Vietnam, and returned to Tulsa in 1971, where he worked as an accountant for a mid-sized agricultural equipment company until his early retirement in 1989. He had a modest pension, no criminal history, and no known debt. After his wife passed in 1988, neighbors said he became increasingly isolated. His only regular outings were to the post office and public library. And yet, bank records showed frequent cash withdrawals in small amounts, always in $200 increments, spread across multiple banks in different towns. Over 18 months, he had withdrawn over $32,000, always in cash, never on weekends, and never from the same town twice. The question, why? A life of quiet transactions. Digging deeper, investigators found that Shasson had purchased an old Winnebago in 1990, used, unremarkable, registered under his real name. Inside, parked at a rest stop just outside of Lebanon, they found a roll of motel receipts, many paid in cash, a single .38 revolver with no rounds fired, a second, smaller notebook containing contact info for businesses that offered money transfer services, 2 burner phones, 1 active, 1 dead, a crumpled Polaroid of an older man wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, taken from inside a car. That man, later confirmed as Franklin E. Little, another retired bookkeeper, found dead in a Kansas motel room in late 1990. The cause of death: blunt force trauma. A secret meeting. The Sun Drop clerk recalled only one visitor seen with Shasson the night of March 12. Around 8:30 p.m., a man in a dark jacket knocked on the door of room 308. The clerk heard a short exchange but couldn't make out the words. He assumed it was a friend or relative. No one signed in. No other guests reported noise. There were no security cameras. But one guest, a trucker staying in room 305, mentioned hearing metal scraping and a single thud around 9:15 p.m. He assumed it was a dropped bag or someone moving furniture. The next morning, the guest in room 307 noted the TV in room 308 had been left on tune to static. By 10:00 a.m., Joseph Shasson was dead. Joseph Bernard Chassin died quietly, violently, and with more unanswered questions than most men leave behind. The worn motel ledger found beside his body was not the diary of a paranoid man or the ramblings of a conspiracy theorist. It was increasingly being seen as a map, and Chassin had been following it for years. But to what? That answer still eluded the investigators from the Laclede County Sheriff's Office, now joined by agents from the Missouri State Highway Patrol's Criminal Investigations Division. In their experience, most motel deaths followed familiar patterns: overdoses, suicides, domestic disputes. But this case, like the 6 others it now seemed connected to, carried none of those signatures. Instead, it whispered of something colder, more calculated, and more intentional. The quietly dead men. Investigators reopened 6 cases from surrounding states. Franklin E. Little, 61, bookkeeper, found dead in Topeka, Kansas motel, 1990. Miles Daughtry, 64, retired financial clerk, died in a Wichita motel under unclear circumstances, 1991. Samuel Gerard, 68, former municipal payroll manager, Oklahoma City, 1989. James Connor, alias, found in Mena, Arkansas, 1990, later ID'd as Richard Dowell, CPA, from Muskogee. Harlan Kiefer, 59, traveled for work, found dead in Tulsa roadside motel, 1992. Benjamin Elms, 65, retired VA accountant, Kansas City MO, motel death labeled inconclusive, 1990. In each case, the victim had minimal family contact. All were linked to small government agencies or firms with large cash handling responsibilities. No one had a criminal record. All were staying in independent motels, not chains. None had their ledgers, notebooks, or receipts recovered at the time of death, which made Chassin the first anomaly, the first one to leave clues behind. A name appears. Inside the second notebook found in Chassin's Winnebago, investigators discovered something else: a list of first names only, each followed by a motel abbreviation and date. Among them, Lyle Elms, KC, June 1990. Bruno Connor, Mena, Sept 1990. Vic Little, Topeka, Oct 1990. Victor Me, Lebanon, TBD. The most jarring entry: Victor Me, Lebanon, TBD. It seemed to suggest Chassin had either anticipated his own death or had been planning a final confrontation. Who was Victor? Was it a name, a pseudonym, a placeholder? The only consistent element: every first name was associated with a location and a death. Chassin had not been documenting his work. He had been documenting someone else. The missing motels. In all 6 previous deaths, the motels where the victim stayed had since closed due to code violations, burned down under suspicious circumstances, changed ownership and lost historical records, or in one case, been completely demolished to make way for a gas station. That level of coincidence gave the investigation new urgency. What if someone had not only been targeting the victims, but erasing the environments they were killed in? The Sun Drop Motel, where Chassin died, was still open. But weeks after his death, the owner received an offer from a shell property developer offering cash to buy the lot. The plan: pave over the motel and build a truck stop. The offer was declined, but narrowly. A faded photo and a man in a hat. The Polaroid in Chassin's glove box, the one of a man in sunglasses, and a ball cap, turned out to be the most actionable piece of evidence yet. A technician enhanced the reflection in the motel window behind the man. It showed the faint outline of Chassin's face, taking the picture from inside a car. That meant he had been watching the man. He had followed him, and he had likely known who he was. The image was compared against DMV records, employment files, and veterans' databases. A weak match was found. Victor Ray Mally's, age 63, last known address in Lawton, Oklahoma. A retired state procurement officer with a quiet record and a strange history of motel stays across 3 states in the late 1980s. But Mally's had died in a house fire in 1992. Or so the record claimed. The death certificate was based on dental records only matched to remains found in a home registered to Mally's name. But Mally's had no known dental provider on record. The match had been made on a third-hand form, never verified by the medical examiner's office. It raised the possibility that Mally's hadn't died at all, but had staged his death. Financial threads. An analyst assigned to the case uncovered something else small but strange. 5 of the 7 known victims, including Shasson, had made wire transfers of nearly identical amounts between $3,500 and $4,000 within days of their deaths. All of the transfers went to different recipients, but each used the same bank routing number tied to a now-defunct credit union in Arkansas. The credit union had been shuttered after an internal fraud investigation in 1993. Its records, incomplete. But one surviving document, a partially damaged fact sheet, included a wire request signed VRM. Victor Ray Mally's. Was there a scam? Investigators began to form a working theory. Sometime in the late 1980s, someone, possibly Mally's, began targeting lonely, aging men with accounting or bookkeeping backgrounds. The pitch may have been simple. We're forming a quiet investment pool, something safe, all off books. You'll help manage the transactions just like in your old job, cash only, minimal risk. Come to this motel, we'll talk. And once the meeting occurred, once the money changed hands, or once the man saw too much, he was eliminated. Cleanly, quickly, quietly. And someone came back to retrieve the documents. Shasson may have been the only one to see the pattern, track it, and go hunting for the killer. If so, he walked into room 308 with full knowledge he might not leave. A last ledger. 6 weeks after Shasson's death, a package arrived at a small law office in Wichita, Kansas. No return address, no note, just a padded envelope containing a pocket ledger, nearly identical to the one found in room 308. A photo of Franklin E. Little with "Confirm Oct" scribbled on the back. A page torn from a 1987 motel directory, with 7 locations circled. The envelope had been postmarked 2 days before Shasson's death. He had been preparing to distribute his findings, or at least make sure they wouldn't disappear with him. As detectives traced the worn threads of Joseph Shasson's final months, they found themselves trapped in a hall of mirrors, identities that didn't exist, companies that vanished, buildings razed, and deaths that left behind more smoke than fire. There was no single glaring clue, only layers of faint impressions, erased trails, and one constant whisper. Victor Ray Mally's. But was he real? Was he the killer? Was he even alive? The burning of 141 Finch Avenue. In 1992, a small, 1-story home in Lawton, Oklahoma, burned to its foundation in the early morning hours of July 2. The house belonged to Victor Ray Mally's, a retired procurement officer from the Oklahoma State Transportation Office. Inside, firemen found the charred remains of a man presumed to be Mally's, through dental records and property documents. But nothing about the death felt definitive. The dental record used for comparison came from a handwritten form faxed from an unlisted dental clinic, one that no longer existed. The local medical examiner signed the death certificate after a 15-minute visual inspection. The backlog of fire-related fatalities at the time was overwhelming. There were no family members to confirm the body. Mally's had none. And no one ever filed for death benefits, social security transfers, or estate inheritance. The ashes were buried in a county plot. The house's remains bulldozed within a month. And Malley's disappeared from every known database. Until a photograph taken by Joseph Chasson placed someone looking very much like him near a Missouri motel, 11 years later. Following the money again. Investigators turned their focus back to the money, the strange, nearly identical wire transfers made by victims before their deaths. One transfer, made by Samuel Gerard in Oklahoma City just days before he was found dead, had an even stranger trail. The recipient, a small industrial supply firm in Pine Bluff, Arkansas Mid-Arc Steel Solutions, which folded just a year after the transfer and left no forwarding records. But a surviving invoice from that company listed its accounting manager as R.M. Valleys, a near anagram of V.R. Malleys. The firm had no building, just a P.O. box. Another ghost. The cleaner. In April 2005, a woman named Darlene Holder, a retired motel maid in Mena, Arkansas, reached out to authorities after seeing a television program about unsolved motel-related deaths. She remembered something odd. There was a man who used to show up a few days after someone died, never said he was police, wore a nice windbreaker, asked to see the room, told us he was collecting belongings for the family. She described him as late 50s or 60s, always wore glasses and a ball cap, drove a dark green or brown sedan, quiet, polite, always alone. When she showed police a picture lineup, she paused on one. A DMV photo of Victor Malleys, circa 1986. That's him, she said. He came after the Connor guy died, said he was his brother. But Connor was Richard Dowell, and Dowell had no brother. This wasn't family. It was containment. Who was killing these men? The murders, if they were murders, appeared to follow a chillingly consistent process. Victims were selected all with backgrounds in finance, accounting, or institutional money handling. They were lured or persuaded to meet in private motel rooms. They often withdrew or transferred small to mid-sized amounts of money just before their deaths. Blunt force trauma was used clean, efficient, almost ritualistic. Ledgers or receipts were taken from each room. In some cases, scenes were wiped or closed quietly. Soon after, the buildings themselves vanished. The motive, that remained elusive. Theories ranged from a targeted blackmail scheme gone wrong, a revenge operation against former accountants tied to a financial scandal, a one-man vigilante operation targeting those who had hidden crimes, or even something broader, a cleanup job for a decades-old laundering network. Chasson may have believed the latter. His final memo, sent to a law office just before his death, included one final chilling sentence. I think this is part of something that started in the late 70s, a real estate shell gone federal. I may be next. The 1970s connection. Digging into older property development fraud cases, investigators found a familiar name buried in a dusty 1979 court docket in Muskogee, Oklahoma. The case involved fraudulent land titles tied to a development company called Highland Redevelopment Partners, which had created false property ownership documents and funneled federal redevelopment grants through shell companies. The account's manager at the time, V. Malleys. Charges were dropped when documents were deemed inadmissible due to improper chain of custody. All records of the company's finances vanished soon after. Many of the players scattered, some died, some disappeared. And one apparently survived, long enough to start cleaning up loose ends. A death without closure. By 2007, most of the surviving investigators had retired or moved on. The motel where Chassin died was eventually sold and converted into a parking lot for a regional trucking depot. There's no marker, no plaque, no public record. Chassin's few remaining relatives, distant cousins, declined to claim his belongings or remains. His ashes were scattered in the Missouri countryside by county services. His notebooks, ledgers, and materials remain in an evidence room, filed under Motel Ledger Murders, open and active, no known suspect. As for Victor Malley's, or whatever name he may have assumed, no one has reported a confirmed sighting since 2005. If he's alive, he would be in his 80s now. But no death certificate exists. No fingerprints have turned up. He is a ghost, one that may have killed half a dozen men and quietly erased a trail of financial deceit stretching back decades. What remains? The only artifacts from the entire investigation still visible to the public are housed in a single locked display at the Kansas Bureau of Investigation's internal training facility. The plaque reads, Ledger 308, Evidence of a Pattern. Submitted anonymously prior to subject's death. It sits in a glass box. Unsolved, unclaimed, and unexplained. Final reflections. In the end, we may never know exactly what Joseph Chassin uncovered or why it cost him his life. He was not a detective, not a federal agent, not a criminal. He was a man with a pencil, a notebook, and a quiet sense that something didn't add up. And he was right. But he got too close. And so, one last question remains behind every closed motel door, every erased record, every name that's just a little too convenient. What kind of story does a killer hide when he writes it in the margins? And what happens when someone dares to read between the lines? Story 5. The pigeon drop scheme that lasted a decade. On a muggy afternoon in 1998, a woman named Lorraine Chandler was walking to her car in a grocery store parking lot in Jackson, Mississippi, when a man in a clean brown blazer and scuffed loafers called out to her. He held up a thick envelope and asked if she had just dropped it. Startled but polite, Lorraine said no. The man looked confused. He opened the envelope inside, neatly stacked and secured with a rubber band, were what looked like dozens of $100 bills. Atop the cash was a note that read, Emergency fund, please return if found. Reward, $1,000. Just then, another man, this one wearing a denim jacket, approached them both. He claimed to have seen the envelope fall. He suggested they turn it in together. That moment, three strangers, a lost envelope, and a shared ethical dilemma marked the beginning of one of the most quietly pervasive con operations in modern American history. The 10-year Southern Pigeon Drop Ring. What is a pigeon drop? The pigeon drop is one of the oldest scams in the book, a confidence trick that preys on a victim's pigeon desire to do the right thing while subtly offering a too-good-to-be-true payout. The mechanics are simple. One con artist finds a lost envelope or wallet with the mark present. The money inside is presented as untraceable. A second con artist enters the scene as a supposed witness to the find. A deal is offered. Split the found money 3 ways, but each person must put up good faith cash to show they won't just run off with it. The mark, the victim, is pressured to withdraw or hand over personal cash or valuables. In the confusion, the con artists disappear with the mark's money, and the found cash is fake. It's quick, it's clean, and most importantly, it relies entirely on psychology. The success of a pigeon drop doesn't come from brute force or threats, but from expertly manipulating human behavior, greed, guilt, trust, and the subtle fear of missing out. The ring begins. Between 1996 and 2006, a loosely organized group of grifters traveled across the Deep South, operating primarily in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and the Florida Panhandle. They never used real names. They rarely stayed in one town for more than 48 hours. And they always worked in pairs. Early police reports show almost no red flags. Victims often felt embarrassed rather than outraged, many not reporting the incident until days later, if at all. The amounts lost varied. $500 from a single mother in Montgomery, $3,200 from a retiree in Mobile, $7,000 in wedding savings from a newlywed couple in Baton Rouge. But by the time federal investigators took notice, the estimated total haul was over $1.7 million. All from cash. All gone. The psychology of the con. The brilliance of the operation was its lack of violence. It didn't need it. According to a 2004 behavioral analysis report from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, the con artists used mirroring language, low-pressure tones, and subtle scripts to give the illusion of shared luck, temporary brotherhood, the opportunity to do good while profiting. The fake envelopes were crafted with military precision crisp bills, often movie prop money layered with real notes on the outside, sealed in thick paper. The cons often praised the mark for their honesty. They presented their own cash as part of the trust-building process. They never rushed, but let the mark feel in control. One former victim, a former nurse named Jeanette Rogers from Augusta, described it this way. It didn't feel like a scam. It felt like a secret handshake, like I'd been picked for something rare. The faces behind the scheme. It took nearly 5 years before authorities even had names to work with. In 2003, a tip from a pawn shop owner in Tallahassee led police to a man who had traded in an envelope labeled emergency fund, identical to those used in the reported cons. The man was arrested for minor fraud and gave the name Lawrence Pike. But his fingerprints matched a known alias from an unrelated 1997 pigeon drop case in Birmingham, Derek Phelps. When police tried to trace him further, they found at least 8 separate aliases, each tied to small con jobs in different states, all misdemeanors, all with short sentences or fines. Even more confounding, each alias had different background documents. Some had tax records, some had utility bills. One even had a short-lived business license in Savannah. The man had built entire lives from thin air. He was a career ghost. And he wasn't working alone. The pairing system. Surveillance footage from a shopping center in Dothan, Alabama showed Pike, or whatever his real name was, working with a woman in a patterned blouse and khaki skirt. She played the witness role, stepping in just at the right time, supporting the narrative, nudging the mark toward the decision to hand over cash. For years, the FBI believed this woman was his wife. But as the cases spread, agents noticed that the witness changed frequently. A middle-aged woman in Georgia, a thin older man in Florida, a young man in Mississippi, clean-shaven and soft-spoken. The one constant was Pike always playing the finder, always calm, always dressed the same. He was the face of the operation, but the organization behind him was flexible, rotating, and nearly impossible to track. The breakdown in Macon. In 2005, everything began to crack. A security camera at a credit union in Macon, Georgia captured footage of Pike and a younger male accomplice leading an elderly man to an ATM. The victim, 74-year-old Harold Burns, withdrew $6,000 in cash, his emergency fund, and placed it in a bank envelope. The con artists promised to hold it with their own cash in a neutral envelope, while they contacted the local sheriff to report the found money. Instead, they swapped envelopes, leaving Burns with a packet of folded newspaper. The swap was clean, quick, and caught on camera. Police arrived 10 minutes later, but the suspects had vanished. However, a partial license plate led to a stolen rental agreement. That agreement was traced to a fake ID, but the ID photo matched earlier DMV records tied to Pike. Derek Phelps, alias. The FBI created a working dossier. Subject likely operates under 812 identities. Caucasian male, approx. 510, age 40-55, possibly fluent in Spanish. Travels state to state, never repeats city within 12-month period. Pattern consistent with traveling grift pair structures. But without fingerprints, and with no violent felonies, the case couldn't escalate to higher priority tiers. Pike was slipping through the cracks. By 2006, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had identified more than 120 suspected pigeon drop incidents across the southeastern United States that shared a consistent profile. Each had a central figure, calm, confident, quietly persuasive. And in many of them, this man appeared. Brown blazer, dusty loafers, warm voice, soft pitch. He went by many names, but his methods never changed. Until agents stumbled upon something unexpected, a motel ledger again. Not from a murder scene this time, but from a quiet arrest in Panama City, Florida, during a routine vagrancy sweep. Officers searching the belongings of an unidentified man found no ID, no cash, and no immediate signs of criminal activity, just a leather-bound notebook and a manila envelope labeled scripts. Inside were handwritten role plays like mini-theater productions, notes on eye contact, pause timing, and when to defer to the witness. The man refused to give his real name. He was booked under John Dillon. But fingerprints told a deeper story. This wasn't Derek Phelps. This wasn't Lawrence Pike. It was Andrew Shaw, a minor con artist from the early 1980s, previously arrested for fraudulent solicitation in New Orleans. He had disappeared from public record in 1984. And yet here he was 22 years later with a notebook that looked more like a training manual than a personal journal. The mentor emerges. Shaw or Dillon or Pike wouldn't talk. Not at first. But during an interview with FBI analyst Greta Lamb, he let slip something chilling. "I didn't write the book, I just updated it." That line set off alarms. If Shaw hadn't written the scripts notebook, who had? And if the scripts were being updated, did that mean the scheme was still active, still evolving, still being taught? The pigeon drop ring, it seemed, had a curriculum, which meant it also had a teacher. The South Florida Theory. A retired investigator from Miami-Dade Financial Crimes, Ernie Morales, reached out to federal agents with a hunch. In 1982, he had investigated a similar string of pigeon drops operating out of South Florida strip malls and bingo halls. The suspect then, a smooth-talking ex-con named Virgil Beeks, known in the Florida con artist circuit as the Philosopher. Beeks, a man in his late 40s at the time, was arrested once for check kiting, but never convicted. He was known for his small crew of followers, many of whom worked small-time grifts under his supervision. His known hangouts included libraries, betting shops, and pawn stores. His nickname came from his habit of quoting Marcus Aurelius and Machiavelli during scams. Beeks disappeared in 1985 after a fire destroyed the storage unit that reportedly held his handwritten confidence files. At the time, no one believed the stories about the files. But now, the idea that someone like Andrew Shaw had resurrected and preserved the philosophy of the con seemed suddenly very possible. A curriculum for deceit. Analysts began treating the scripts in Shaw's notebook not just as role play, but as teaching tools. Each script was annotated with corrections, checkmarks, and alternate endings. For instance, if Mark hesitates, try. It's not about the money, it's about doing what's right. Too aggressive, slow speech by 20%. Use eye squint and step back 6 inches. Don't say found cash, say forgotten funds. Less risky. There were 9 full scripts in total, and 3 included instructions for different pairings, suggesting it was designed for rotating partners with specific psychological profiles. Each version was more refined than the last. Whoever wrote the original scripts understood the interplay of emotion, timing, and trust with surgical precision. It was a performance art perfected over decades. And if Shaw was only the student who had been the director, the map, tucked into the back of Shaw's notebook, was a laminated, aged road map. It showed the southeastern U.S., marked with faded red ink. Some cities had stars. Some had check marks. A few had question marks. The locations lined up with known pigeon drop incidents dating back to 1983, including early cases never attributed to a larger scheme. Cities included Pensacola, FL, Montgomery, AL, Hattiesburg, MS, Columbus, GA, Valdosta, GA, Biloxi, MS. Many of them were retirement hubs, small cities with vulnerable populations and limited investigative capacity. Each star had a year next to it, but some went as far back as 1979. Was this a tracking tool? Or was it a record of successful operations? If so, then this scheme had begun decades earlier than anyone realized. Shaw talks. Eventually, Shaw spoke. In an off-the-record interview with Lamb, he admitted he had met Virgil Beeks in 1983. Beeks had been living in a duplex outside Ocala, Florida, operating what Shaw called a school for swindlers. He'd take you in if you brought him something good, a trick, a play. He made you test it in front of him. If he liked it, he'd add it to the book. According to Shaw, Beeks had over 50 students between 1975 and 1985. We called him the doctor. He never ran the cons himself, just designed them, refined them, taught them like sermons. Shaw claimed that the notebook he carried was a 5th-generation copy of the original Confidence Codex. Beeks died in the early 90s, according to Shaw, or at least vanished for good. But his teachings lived on, and some believed them to be sacred. A strange legacy. Agents began referring to the growing operation as the Confidence School Ring. It wasn't a gang. It wasn't a cartel. It was a pedagogical network built on trust, oral tradition, and handwritten doctrine. Every few years, someone would pick up the mantle, update the scripts, and run the program again, usually with small, rotating teams. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the craft. There's an elegance to it, Shaw reportedly said. No guns, no threats, just the idea that you and me can agree to something and I walk away with everything. In the spring of 2007, a 68-year-old man named Roger Lowry walked into a rural police station outside Meridian, Mississippi. He carried a plastic grocery bag containing a Bible, a tattered manila envelope, and a sealed letter labeled, "To whom it may concern, I was taught to lie." Lowry claimed he had been part of a class back in 1994, where men met weekly in an abandoned bowling alley to rehearse life lessons. What they were actually practicing were versions of the pigeon drop not called scams, but plays. Lowry never ran a full con. He said he got out before the real tests began, but he still had the envelope his mentor gave him. Inside was a script. It was nearly identical to those found in Andrew Shaw's notebook, same beats, same language, same call and response patterns, but it had something the others didn't. A hand-drawn seal on the last page. It depicted a dove with an olive branch perched atop a chessboard, with 3 Latin words beneath it. Ars sensus fides. Art perception trust. It was the only known insignia of what the FBI would later call the confidence line. A hidden network. Lowry's envelope reopened the case in an unexpected way. It wasn't just that the ring had endured for decades, it had apparently branched. Former FBI financial crimes analyst Greta Lamb described it this way. We realized this wasn't just a school or a ring anymore. It was a distributed intelligence network. Think of it like an underground improv troupe, scattered, low profile, but connected by shared language and values. Agents began cross-referencing old con cases for common phrasing, behavioral cues, or signatures. And the threads began to appear. A found money case in Charlotte, NC in 2002, where the witness said the conman used the phrase, "It's about right, not rich." A 1997 scam in San Antonio, TX, where both scammers wore lapel pins shaped like birds. A 2009 case in Tulsa, OK, where the victim recalled the suspect sketching a dove on a napkin before departing. These weren't coincidences. They were rituals. The last known con. The most recent case, attributed to the line, happened in Baton Rouge in 2013. The victim was a 34-year-old nurse named Kimberly Rousseau. She had parked at a pharmacy when she was approached by a well-dressed man who held up an envelope and asked if it belonged to her. Moments later, a second person, a soft-spoken woman in a green coat, arrived, claiming to have seen where the envelope came from. Together, they convinced Rousseau to enter the store and purchase gift cards totaling $2,500 to establish fairness before they would split the money. The envelope they gave her in return was filled with blank paper. By the time she realized the switch, they were gone. But Rousseau remembered one specific thing. The man had a dove tattoo on his hand, and the woman kept calling him doctor. It was the first confirmed sighting of the old mentor nickname since Shaw's arrest almost a decade earlier. The end or the beginning? Federal interest in the case officially cooled in 2015. Financial crimes resources were redirected to digital fraud, ransomware, and crypto schemes. The pigeon drop was considered archaic, nonviolent, and too analog for modern trends. But several agents kept files open in their private notes. One of them, a retired profiler named Philip X, summarized the entire decade-long investigation this way. The pigeon drop is a mirror. You see what you want. They hand you the fantasy, a little luck, a little justice, a little reward, and you go along with it because it feels like a secret you earned. And the best lies, they don't take your money, they take your confidence. The line's core principles. From the surviving scripts and interviews, agents were able to piece together the unspoken rules that govern the line's operation. Unlike street-level cons or digital scammers, this group had a code. Never involve weapons. The con must remain psychological. Intimidation ruined the art. Select those who believe in karma. If the mark believed in the morality of doing the right thing, they were more susceptible to pressure under ethical pretenses. Use decoys that feel real. Money should look legitimate at a glance, but not stand up to close scrutiny. The mark should never feel like a fool, only unlucky. Vanishing is part of the performance. Every con ended with a quiet exit. No gloating, no anger, no lingering. Leave no digital trace. All roles were memorized. Phones were disposable. Rentals paid in cash. Names changed often, but mannerisms did not. The con is sacred. Students were chosen carefully, tested rigorously, and taught the play as an art form, not a hustle. Legacy and reflection. In the end, no one was ever fully prosecuted for the multi-decade operation. Andrew Shaw was released in 2012 and promptly vanished. Virgil Beeks was never found, nor confirmed dead. Roger Lowry's testimony was filed and archived, but he died in 2016. The confidence line quietly dissolved. Or perhaps went further underground. There are still occasional sightings: a man in a tan blazer in a Dallas parking lot, a woman with an envelope in Tulsa, a tattoo of a dove behind an ear in Mobile. But like all the best illusions, the trick lies not in what you see but in what you choose to believe. Final thought. Some crimes come with alarms and chases. Others come with silence, a smile, and an offer too perfect to be real. The pigeon drop is a whisper of a crime so light it barely leaves a bruise, but it does something far more dangerous. It shakes your belief in goodness. And as long as that temptation remains, the idea that fortune might fall into your lap if you just follow the right stranger into the right parking lot, the con will live on. Because the game isn't over. It's just waiting for its next audience. Story 6. The bookstore fire that erased a life. In the heart of St. Charles, Missouri, nestled between a laundromat and an insurance office, stood a faded storefront with a hand-painted sign. Eagle's Nest Books, rare and used. To passers-by, it was just another dusty shop with tilted shelves and musty paperbacks. But to the handful of regulars, Eagle's Nest was a sanctuary, a space for long conversations, obscure history texts, and the quiet company of its soft-spoken owner, Frank Delaney. Frank was a man out of time. He wore thick cardigans, rimless glasses, and carried himself with the unhurried grace of someone who had nowhere else to be. He remembered names, birthdays, and favorite authors. He served tea in chipped mugs to patrons who sat on fraying sofas in the back room and leafed through books no one had asked about in decades. But on the morning of December 17, 2009, a fire ripped through Eagle's Nest at 3:12 a.m. By dawn, the shop was gone, and so was Frank. No body, no witnesses, no definitive cause. Just ashes, charred pages, and a question that would haunt investigators for the next 7 years. Did Frank Delaney die in that fire, or did he use it to disappear? The man no one really knew. Frank moved to St. Charles in 1994, according to property records. He purchased the small commercial building on Elm Street under his full name and opened the bookstore 6 months later. Neighbors described him as gentle, deliberate, and slightly mysterious. But here's what no one could confirm: where Frank had lived before 1994, whether he had any family, where he got the funds to open the store outright, why he never took vacations, paid for advertising, or renewed his business license after 2001. There were no old photographs in the store, no personal artifacts beyond a few worn sweaters. His upstairs apartment was sparsely furnished and obsessively clean. His library was vast but lacked any books published after 1999. There were no cell phones, no credit cards, no online presence. Frank Delaney had built a life from books and silence. And when the fire consumed both, investigators were left with an unnerving possibility. There may never have been a Frank Delaney at all. The blaze started in the basement, according to the fire marshal's report. The cause was ruled undetermined, though there were traces of accelerants in the southeast storage room. That room held old tax records, several unopened boxes, and most of the shop's unsorted inventory. What raised eyebrows? There were no working smoke detectors. The fire suppression system was disabled manually weeks before. A receipt found in the alley trash showed a purchase of industrial-grade lighter, fluid 2 days earlier from a nearby hardware store, paid in cash. Despite this, the fire wasn't immediately treated as arson. Why? Because there was no known motive. Frank's financials were murky but showed no major debts. He owned the building free and clear. The inventory was largely unsellable, and insurance on the business had lapsed in 2006. In other words, there was nothing to gain by burning it down. Unless, of course, the goal wasn't money, but escape. The missing man. Emergency crews found no body in the ruins, not even remains. It was unusual but not impossible. Temperatures in the basement had exceeded 800 degrees F. That could, in theory, destroy bone and tissue beyond recognition. Still, the fire had burned for less than an hour before being extinguished. Experts from the Missouri Fire Investigations Bureau concluded that if someone had been inside, they should have found at least partial remains. They didn't. And no one saw Frank that day, not at the coffee shop he visited each morning, not at the antique market where he bought newspapers every Thursday. The last known sighting came from a customer on December 15, 2 days before the fire, who said Frank seemed tired and mentioned he was finally ready to move on. At the time, no one thought much of the phrase, but in retrospect, it read like a quiet farewell. The name that didn't exist. In early 2010, local detectives began trying to trace Frank's background. The name Frank Delaney matched a few distant records, but none aligned with his physical description, age, or location history. There were no high school transcripts, no university records, no social security data prior to 1993, no DMV license prior to his Missouri registration. Everything about Frank's identity began in 1990, for the year he arrived in St. Charles. His social security number was legitimate, but belonged to a deceased man in Idaho, who had died in 1983. The real Frank Delaney had been buried for over a decade when the bookstore opened. Whoever had operated Eagle's Nest was Frank. He was someone using Frank's name. A stranger's fingerprints. Detectives retrieved a single usable fingerprint from a tea mug found in the apartment's upstairs kitchenette. When run through the FBI's database, it came back with a hit. The match: Gregory L. Ames, born 1949 in Maryland. Arrested in 1978 for mail fraud, served 18 months, and vanished after skipping probation in 1982. According to that file, Ames had been a financial analyst who operated a fraudulent investment firm for 3 years in the Washington, D.C. area. He took in over $400,000 in fake securities and was believed to have stashed money in offshore accounts. When the heat came down, he fled. No trace was found until now. Gregory Ames had been living in Missouri under an assumed name for nearly 15 years, running a dusty bookstore and serving tea to college students and retirees. And no one had suspected a thing. The bigger question: once they confirmed the man's identity, the investigation shifted. Detectives contacted federal agencies to determine whether Ames had ever reclaimed the stolen funds. No such records were found, but a strange pattern emerged. Between 1994 and 1998, 5 wire transfers totaling $220,000 were made to small banks in rural Missouri. All originated from shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. The destination accounts belonged to Eagle's Nest Holdings LLC, a business that did not officially exist. All transfers stopped after 1999. Why? That's still unknown. Some believe Ames had cashed out his fraud slowly, using it to fund the bookstore as both a business and a front. Others think he may have had a change of heart, choosing a life of anonymity over extravagance. In either case, it raised a terrifying possibility. Was the fire a random accident that ended a second chance, or was it a perfectly staged disappearance, the final move of a criminal who had already gotten away once before? By spring of 2010, the mystery surrounding the Eagle's Nest fire had become a cold wind that swept through St. Charles. The storefront remained boarded up, the windows blackened by soot and time. Locals still passed it with a quiet reverence, some believing Frank Delaney had perished tragically, others whispering that he'd simply melted back into the shadows. But to Detective Cara Levy of the Missouri State Police, The case was anything but cold. She believed the fire wasn't an accident, and that Frank Delaney hadn't died that night. She believed Gregory Ames had vanished a second time. And this time, he'd planned it better. A clue in a coffee shop. It began with a tip from a barista. At a downtown cafe 3 blocks from the burned bookstore, a worker recalled a man who matched Frank Delaney's description entering the shop on the morning after the fire. He didn't buy anything. He just looked around, checked the community bulletin board, and left. The employee hadn't thought much of it until he saw Frank's photo in a newspaper a week later. Was it possible? Had Frank returned to the scene to confirm the success of his plan? Levy tracked down the cafe's security footage, but the tapes had been wiped after 7 days. Nothing was preserved. Still, the barista's recollection was detailed. Brown overcoat, worn shoes, glasses with a chipped lens, all of which matched items later recovered from the apartment above Eagle's Nest. Why wear those things, Levy wondered, unless he wanted to be seen one last time. The storage unit. 6 months after the fire, a lead emerged from a self-storage facility on the outskirts of town. A manager cleaning out delinquent units found one registered under FD Holdings, an innocuous name paid for in cash for the past 11 years. No ID on file, no forwarding address, but what was inside stunned investigators. Dozens of used and annotated books, many with false dust jackets covering unrelated titles. 2 vintage typewriters. A box of 1990s burner cell phones. A suitcase containing $18,700 in bundled $50 bills. And a smaller manila envelope labeled replicas. Inside were identification materials, social security cards, birth certificates, even 3 valid Missouri driver's licenses, all with different names but Frank Delaney's face. One identity was registered to a post office box in Hannibal, MO, opened just 2 weeks before the fire. That P.O. box had not been accessed since. Whoever had prepared these documents had no intention of staying in St. Charles. He was building an exit. A letter with no stamp. The discovery of the storage unit forced law enforcement to reopen the case as suspected insurance fraud and identity manipulation. But then another wrinkle appeared. In June 2010, a woman named Eliza Whittaker arrived at the St. Charles police station, holding a letter she claimed had been mailed to her apartment anonymously. It was typewritten on aged yellow stationery and began, "If you're reading this, I've done what most people only dream of, rewritten myself." The letter went on to describe years of living under the weight of a false identity, a life born from one mistake too many and $1 too far. It didn't mention crimes, only a desire to disappear and live in stillness. The final line read, "To vanish with dignity, one must burn their footprints." The signature was typed as FD. There was no return address, no stamp, just the envelope slid under Whittaker's door one night. Who was Eliza Whittaker? She had been Frank Delaney's tenant for 4 years, living above the bookstore in the rear apartment. He had reduced her rent after she lost her job in 2006. She described Frank as a kind ghost, always present, always polite, and always vague. He never spoke of family. Never used the internet. Never once received a personal phone call. She believed deeply that Frank was running from something. She just hadn't known how far. The Ames file. Gregory Ames's old case file from 1978 was thin. Back then, white-collar crime rarely made headlines unless millions were involved. But his scam had been slick. A dummy investment firm called Bluefield Holdings, promising lucrative returns from overseas shipping bonds. He'd targeted retirees, former military officers, and small business owners. He offered contracts printed on thick, faux legal paper with embossed seals. He even staged investor meetings in hotel conference rooms using rented suits and actors. And when the SEC came knocking, he vanished. Ames had been a ghost since 1982, until possibly the fire. What remained unanswered was how, or if he accessed the money he had stolen. The wire transfers tied to Eagle's Nest Holdings totaled just over $220,000, but estimates of his fraud placed losses above $400,000. Where was the rest? A strange routine. Another strange pattern emerged when analysts reviewed Frank's movements over the years. According to utility bills, surveillance footage, and vendor logs, Frank had maintained a rigid schedule. He bought supplies in cash, always from the same 3 stores. He never traveled more than 20 miles from St. Charles. He received no visitors ever. He read every local paper meticulously, highlighting stories about bankruptcy, fraud, or sudden deaths. Why those particular stories? Levy theorized that Frank may have been monitoring other potential exit points, looking for new identities to assume. Death notices, sudden disappearances, unclaimed estates. If he was planning to shed the Frank Delaney persona, he needed a new shell to crawl into. The Whisper Network. In 2011, a private investigator named Jonah Kerr, who had worked white-collar fraud in the 90s, contacted Missouri authorities. He believed Gregory Ames was part of an informal fugitive network of mid-level financial scammers who had traded resources over the years. Fake documents, burner identities, safe houses. This wasn't a syndicate. It was more like an alumni group, criminals who had survived the first bust and gone underground, helping each other stay vanished. According to Kerr, there were at least 14 names on his vanisher watch list. And one of them, a man operating a bookstore in Nevada under the name Edward Glinner, who bore a striking resemblance to Ames. When authorities arrived in Nevada, however, Glinner's bookstore had closed 2 months earlier. The lease had been terminated. No forwarding address was provided. Again, they were too late. The trail ends in dust. The last known clue came in the form of a journal recovered from a second storage unit discovered in 2013, this time in Cape Girardeau. The journal, handwritten in clean cursive, contained reflections on solitude, the ethical nature of lies, and an obsession with erasure. One entry read, "Truth is heavy, fiction floats. If I can't be forgotten, I'll never be free." Another, "Books rot, identities dissolve, everything borrowed must be returned." Though the author never signed the entries, several references matched lines from letters recovered in St. Charles. The handwriting, too, was a close match for inscriptions found in books from Eagle's Nest. But the final page offered a chilling confession. "I left the door open because part of me wanted to be followed, but not found." And then nothing. No trace of Frank. No new sightings of Ames. Just the fading echo of a life carefully unwound. The town of St. Charles eventually moved on. The building that once housed Eagle's Nest books was sold, gutted, and turned into a boutique wine shop. The scorched wood was replaced, the soot washed away, but whispers about Frank Delaney never fully disappeared, nor did the questions. Detective Cara Levy kept the case file open in her drawer long after her retirement in 2016. Inside it were dozens of notes, annotated timelines, and a photo of the storefront mid-blaze, a single plume of smoke curling upward like punctuation on a life no one could quite define. And on the top of the folder was a quote, scribbled in blue pen. "The most convincing fiction is the one with no ending." Gregory Ames, alias Frank Delaney, had become a ghost not once but twice. And the evidence suggested he had help. The name in the ledger. In late 2015, a tax audit in Cincinnati, Ohio unearthed an unexpected connection. A suspicious bookkeeping firm flagged for irregular offshore transfers held a client record under the name C. Mallory. The address on file: a defunct P.O. box in Hannibal, Missouri, the same town where one of Frank Delaney's forged identities had been traced. Digging deeper, analysts found that C. Mallory had wired small amounts $2,000 to $5,000 to a network of accounts in New Mexico, Oregon, and Nevada over the span of 3 years. Each transfer came with a memo line: for resettlement. Authorities believe these were payments to intermediaries, people who specialize in erasing pasts, crafting new identities, and placing their clients in quiet corners of the country where no one would ask questions. Mallory's firm dissolved days after the audit began. Its owner disappeared before charges could be filed. No arrest was ever made. The ghost's paper trail. By 2017, forensic accountants mapped the full movement of the funds Gregory Ames had once stolen in the 1970s. Out of roughly $410,000 in fraudulently obtained investments, $220,000 was tracked through wire transfers to Missouri banks between 1994 and 1999, appeared as cash bundles in the Cape Girardeau and St. Charles storage units, was withdrawn in Nevada in 2011 from an account opened under Edward Glinner. The remaining $105,000 never found. But the breadcrumbs pointed to one clear conclusion. Ames had been gradually withdrawing his stolen life, not just the money, but the persona itself. Each fake identity was lived in just long enough to appear credible, then discarded like a finished book. The pattern was slow, deliberate, and never greedy. As if the goal wasn't wealth, but invisibility. The possible sightings. Though officially closed as of 2018, the case file still collected reports. In 2019, a librarian in Santa Fe reported a man fitting Frank Delaney's description who spent 3 hours reading a book on Eastern philosophy before vanishing. In 2021, a retired bookstore owner in Montana claimed a visitor asked her, cryptically, "How long do you think it takes for a life to become fiction?" And in 2023, a dental hygienist in Oregon reported a new patient who had no digital history but paid in exact cash, brought his own pen, and asked whether dental records were stored on paper or computer. None of these could be confirmed. No photos, no fingerprints, no follow-up. Just echoes. Like a story told too softly to hear clearly, but too clearly to ignore. The psychology of erasure. Criminal psychologists analyzing the case noted something unusual about Ames. Most fugitives seek escape through excess: drugs, sex, travel, fast money. Ames did the opposite. He went smaller, quieter. He edited himself out of public life page by page. Experts suggest he may have suffered from a form of post-fraud guilt, turning his life into a kind of penance, not out of remorse for his victims, but out of exhaustion, a need to control a narrative he could no longer live in. One analyst, Dr. Laurel Cheen, wrote in her report, "He was a man who understood two things very well. Paper is more patient than memory. If you can rewrite the story often enough, eventually even the truth forgets where it started." The victims revisited. Despite the quiet grandeur of Ames's vanishing act, the victims of his original fraud never saw restitution. In 1978, over a dozen retirees lost their savings, many of them never recovered financially. The daughter of one such victim, Carol Brecker, offered this reflection in a 2020 interview. "He stole from people who trusted too easily. My father thought he was investing in something real. Instead, he funded a ghost story." That quote, ironically, became the title of a documentary produced years later. Ghost Story: The Man Who Erased Himself. It aired only once on public television, but it reignited public interest in Gregory Ames's story and introduced a generation to the idea that disappearance could be an art form. The Last Artifact. In 2022, a small-town librarian in Sandpoint, Idaho, cataloging a donation bin, found a copy of The Ethics of Forgetting, a now out-of-print 1983 philosophy book. Inside the front cover was a handwritten note. To whoever finds this, truth is not always justice. Memory is not always mercy. But story is always a choice. The library reached out to local law enforcement. Handwriting analysis showed a high probability match with the inscriptions in the Cape Girardeau Journal. But nothing further could be gleaned. No fingerprints, no surveillance, no follow-up visits. Just the book and the note. Reflection: crime is a vanishing act. Most crime stories end in capture, trial, and justice, or in some cases, tragedy. But this one ends in silence. Gregory Ames didn't vanish in a burst of speed or violence. He disappeared like the slow fade of ink from an old page. Every move he made was deliberate, calculated not to shock, but to slip past attention. He wasn't running from justice. He was walking toward a blank page. And in that choice, he exposed an uncomfortable truth about identity. That it's fragile, that it's paper-thin, that with enough discipline, a person can shed their entire history not because they want to be someone new, but because they no longer want to be known at all. Frank Delaney, the quiet man with the bookstore, may have been the best version of Gregory Ames, the one who drank tea, remembered birthdays, and handed out obscure novels with handwritten notes in the margins.